I hate the Jedi.
From my point of view, the Jedi are evil!
Now, I know the Jedi are beloved icons the world over because they're framed as these great peacekeeping warriors who maintain a serene state of mind and just live their lives putting the galaxy to rights. And I also know that everyone who grew up with this franchise thinks that swinging a lightsaber is the best thing to do with your hands since man discovered wanking. Now, George Lucas and many other writers who came after him have expanded on the simple good versus evil narrative and have tried to portray the Jedi's faults and their flaws, making them more interesting, because that's the best thing you can do to make any aspect of your story more interesting. But for me, they might have done it a little too well. I'm going to give you some quick warnings because this video is going to have some very strong and occasionally harsh opinions. And I want to be clear on this that I am not making it to get under people's skin. I do believe you should never fear people's reactions to your opinions, but you also shouldn't go out of your way to provoke people into upset either. So, as I will explain in a minute, this is not a bad faith criticism. This is my genuine first impression of the Jedi and why I see them the way I do. Second, I'm going to be making a lot of real-world comparisons here, so if your reaction to that is get your reality out of my fantasy space opera, I can't answer that. Any piece of fiction inevitably has shades of reality in it. The original trilogy was heavily influenced by Vietnam, and the prequels are even more overt in their criticism of politics and bureaucracy. And the sequels... well, I won't be talking about them that much. And the final warning is, I approach things very much from a death of the author perspective. I certainly don't believe the author's interpretation of their own work is unimportant, but it's not really something I put that much weight on. Not to say that adherence to the author is the wrong way of looking at things, it's just specifically the way I look at media. And I do not accept that just because something was written and more importantly framed a certain way, that it has to be interpreted as such. I think that is a very limited and shallow way of interpreting media. Writers are not in fact right all the time. This is very easy to understand if you've ever written something and you've gotten so far into it and so close to it that you don't actually realise what you've written and more importantly the implications of it until it's down on the page and out in the world. Most of the time, this stuff is open to interpretation, but there are occasions when the writer can be outright wrong about their own creations.
No!
My favourite example of this is Devin Grayson, who wrote the Nightwing comics for a time, and included a scene where Nightwing gets raped by a female vigilante, and her 10-year-long insistence that it wasn't rape does nothing to change the fact that it is, by very definition, rape. So yeah, Devin Grayson all those years ago opened my eyes to the fact that the writer is not always right and can in fact be wrong about the things they themselves create. So if any of those points of view are going to be a bother, you are really not going to like this video. And going back to my good faith declaration, I think it's important to take a brief look at an overview of my history with Star Wars so you can understand why I feel the way I do about the Jedi. Because the whole point of my channel is trying to determine whether something is good or bad objectively or whether it's just your own biases telling you something. A good Star Wars example of this is the end of The Mandalorian Season 2, where so many Star Wars fans finally, after so long, got to see their childhood hero in his prime. For those people, this was an amazing experience. For me, it just didn't touch me the same way it did them. So while I still do enjoy the scene, it's not gonna get any extra points from me. But as a massive fangirl of certain franchises myself, I can more than relate to the feeling. So I just want to make sure I lay out all my biases on the table for you. Okay, so now you know why I'm explaining this? Let's explain it. I never watched Star Wars as a youngling. I didn't watch it, my parents didn't watch it, it just wasn't a presence in our house. The first time I ever saw A New Hope was in my 4th year media studies class and I thought, that was fun. So I went home and I watched the other two and I thought, that was fun. I didn't watch the prequels immediately because I'd heard they were bad and Despite the fact that I liked the original trilogy, I didn't like them enough to watch the prequels just purely for curiosity's sake. Then the sequel trilogy was announced, and I knew my friends were going to want to go see it, so I thought, may as well catch up on the prequels. And I watched them, and I thought, those were fun. Yeah, I did not get the prequel hate whatsoever. I mean, the Phantom Menace's structure is a little weird, and that makes it slow in places. The Clone Wars is the only one I would say is out and out a bad movie, but even then it has its bright sparks, namely anytime Ewan McGregor's on screen, and Revenge of the Sith is a pretty good film. Any other problems I had with them were present in the original trilogy, so yeah, I did not get the prequel hate, at all. And I watched The Force Awakens, and I thought, that was fun. Then I watched The Last Jedi, and I thought, Yeah, the opinions I'm about to spout about the Jedi might have you confused as to why I didn't like this film, but watching The Last Jedi was kind of like sitting down with that friend. You know that friend. Everyone has that friend. Who is trying to convince you that they're a deep and edgy thinker, but you're just sitting there thinking, yeah, if you actually knew what you were talking about, that might actually make sense. And I didn't watch Rise of Skywalker because I don't watch things I expect to disappoint me. And I was pretty much done with Star Wars. I'd given it a try, and even though I liked it well enough, I just wasn't a fan, and I never was going to be a fan. And eventually my YouTube recommendations were flooded with Baby Yoda compilations, and I thought, okay, fine, I will watch this fucking show. And God help me, I loved it. It's by no means a perfect show. It's repetitive as hell, it has loads of plot holes, it meanders around, it's a little bit directionless sometimes, but the good so far outweighed the bad. And not only did I love The Mandalorian, but I loved the Mandalorians. I thought their culture was so interesting. And I knew there was a wealth of material online, so I just thought, I'll go find out more about them. And in doing just that, I discovered something that made me switch my view on Star Wars dramatically. Anyone who watches my channel knows I'm a massive comic book fan, and one of the things I love most about comics is the shared universe aspect. And while a lot of books, movies, even trilogies of movies do have great world building, this is just a kind of storytelling that I thought was exclusive to comic books. And I was a fool. Star Wars does it too. And from that point, I was hooked, and I've been on a Star Wars binge ever since. So there you have it. That's the angle I'm approaching this from. And you should probably keep in mind that my love for the Mandalorians is another bias you should probably take into consideration when listening to my feelings on the Jedi. And when I say the Jedi, I am not talking about individual Jedi. Obi-Wan Kenobi is my favourite Star Wars character.
Now, that's better.
Master Plo Koon is an absolute sweetheart.
Your sense of humor is improving.
And Ahsoka Tano is one of the best, most relatable, frankly admirable characters I have ever seen. And her character progression is just masterfully written. The only character progression I can potentially think might have been better was Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender. She's also significantly more awesome because she left the Jedi Order. Now, when I say Jedi, I mean the Order, the collective. What they believe, what they stand for, and most importantly, what they do. And obviously individual Jedi have differing levels of complicity in this, but you have to judge the collective by the actions of its members and judge the members by their complicity within the collective. That's how organizations work, particularly powerful ones. So, though I like the Jedi individually,
we agree that as a group they're rather stupid.
So, why do I hate the Jedi Order? I think the best way to explain that is to take a look at the point where I first started to feel that sliver of disgust rise up in me. And it's this scene.
How feel you?
Cold, sir.
Afraid, are you?
No, sir.
See through you. We can.
Your thoughts dwell on your mother.
I miss her.
Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
He is to be trained then?
No, he will not be trained.
And I watched this scene for the first time and I thought, you bastards. You absolute fucking bastards. We're going to talk about the Jedi's beliefs on attachment later, so this is going to be further clarified. But even without that, I am watching a 9-year-old slave boy standing in a room full of strange adults judging him, finding him wanting, and rejecting him to his face. They then have the gall and the lack of hearts in their chest to then shame this again 9-year-old little boy for being scared and missing his mother. Once again, I can hear the attachment justification, and it's so hard to separate the issues I have with this order into very clear, distinct points, because it's just flimsy justification on top of flimsy justification, and they're all interwoven around each other. So it's so hard to get into one thing without being drawn into another. But I'm gonna try. But even if it was necessary, which I don't believe it is, even so, you have put a child slave in a room with strange adults who have said straight to his face that he is not wanted. Not to mention the fact that he's been ripped away from his mother, and oh boy, is that another thing I get to talk about. But you do this to him, and then shame him, and don't tell me they aren't shaming him. They are telling him that his very justified feelings are wrong and will lead to bad things happening. They are shaming him for being scared and missing his mother. You absolute fucking bastards. So I apologise if this is going to be one of the more fired up ones, because if there are two things that provoke this kind of reaction in me, it's children and slavery. I know every decent person feels horribly about these things, but the difference is most people have a handle on their reactions to them. For me, these are just topics that... Have you ever had that reaction where your brows furrow, your throat closes up, your fists clench, you might even feel like you want to cry? It just provokes that kind of uncontrollable physical reaction within me. I'm not saying I care about these issues more than anyone else, I just have trouble hiding my response to them. So this is a fair warning for anyone for whom these topics will be difficult to hear. So, despite the many issues I have with the way Jedi treat children, it's by far not the only thing I take issue with. So, why else do I hate the Jedi? Well, they used an entire slave army to put down a quite frankly justified political rebellion in furtherance of their religious war. They're arrogant, they're high-minded, they're answerable to no one, and their relationship with emotion is psychotic. So let's take a look at those issues and go through them one at a time.
Always kiss your children goodnight, even if they're already asleep. H. Jackson Brown, Jr.
So clearly I have very strong feelings about the Jedi's approach to children. And if I were prone to brevity, I might be tempted to leave it at the council room scene with Anakin. But I think you all know I'm not going to do that. So, in our further horrific deep dive into the Jedi's approach to kids, let's start where they do, with recruitment. The acquisitions department of the Jedi Order, and if that doesn't tell you something all on its own, find Force-sensitive children, take them away from their parents, their communities, and any other support networks they might have, take them to the Order, sever all attachments to those vital aspects of a child's life I've just listed in order to keep them on the light side, as is their justification. Now, the biggest argument I've seen for this point is that the Jedi are doing nothing wrong because they get the parents' consent. First of all, the Jedi are a very well-respected religious order who for a very long time were held in reverence by the populace.
Have you come to free us?
No, I'm afraid not.
I think you have. Why else would you be here?
This kind of soft power can be very dangerous, and even the most loving of parents could be convinced that they were robbing their child of something if they didn't give them up. This puts parents, particularly those who can't advocate for themselves, in an impossible position. Either they give up all rights to their baby or live a life feeling as though they've denied them their birthright. And I want to be clear that I do not believe the Jedi are purposefully manipulating parents into giving up their children, but there is a power dynamic at play here that they are 100% taking advantage of to have full rights and access to these kids. And even without this, imagine you, as a parent, have a child who can move things with its mind. Babies and toddlers are hard enough to look after as it is. How are you going to care for a child that has this kind of power that you neither understand nor can help him with? Then this very important person in a robe comes knocking at your door and says, I can train your child. Well, great. But you never get to see him again. And we're going to sever all attachments he has to you, the rest of his family, and his community. No, you can't do that. Well, then I won't train him. What choice do parents really have? And there's the quite frankly horrific argument that not only does parental consent make it okay, but the parents consider it a great honour. We've already covered consent and why it's kind of iffy in these situations, but let's say it's not. Let's say this is a completely eyes-open, non-coercive scenario for the parents. You don't realise that this is still unjustifiable because the sin is in the asking. Consenting is the parents' sin. Asking is the Jedi's. They shouldn't be asking to begin with. And I can hear but the Sith, and the Force, and the Jedi's numbers, and we're coming to that, believe me. But to just quickly bat it away for now, if you have to do something fundamentally immoral, I would argue horrifically so, in order to stop the bad, I'm sorry to tell you this, but you are still doing something fundamentally immoral. And this isn't even like the scenario where a leader had to make a tough, immoral decision for a greater good. It's not even that. That can be argued on some level. And we'll be covering that in section 3, I believe, when we talk about different moral perspectives and religious and ideological perspectives, etc. But this is not even that. This is a systematic implementation of something so immoral it boils my blood. Again, I can't... You can give me the Force and the Sith and the Jedi and they have to keep their numbers up all day long. That changes nothing about how immoral the action is. So I know I've repeated myself quite a lot saying we're going to be getting back to a certain point in different parts of this video, but please take this as one whole complaint split into parts because they all feed into each other. And if I don't have time to explain something in one part, it will be explained in another. So anyway, back to this point. Parental consent also means very little because the parents are not the one you are committing the greatest wrong against. The child is the one whose rights most people would be the most concerned about. And again, greater good argument me all you want, but if you're not worried, first and foremost, about the children, then why are you even doing any of this? And this whole honour thing, it might be the absolute worst argument, it really might. Now, fair warning, I'm going to be talking for the next couple minutes about some fairly horrific things, not in great detail, but I will be mentioning infanticide, so here's a time code if you don't want to deal with that, because God knows I don't want to. But I can't believe people don't realise that this whole honour argument makes it more insidious, not less. Parents do a hell of a lot of fucked up things to their children in the name of their honour. Forcibly marrying off their daughters, restricting their freedoms. Ever heard the term honour killing? And perhaps the most concrete example of this comes from a documentary I watched about a certain part of Madagascar where twins are considered cursed. And to preserve their honour and place in the tribe, parents have to expose them to die or be cast out. And as this journalist is talking to these people, you get the sense that the ones who did give up their babies didn't even actually believe it. They just did it to preserve their honour and the respect from the elders. And to repeat myself yet again, I will be covering the power of groupthink later in this video. But the point is, just because there are parents who are strong enough to walk away doesn't mean crap in the grand scheme of how right and wrong this is. Consenting is the parents' sin. Asking is the elders'. Now, I know the Jedi have never done anything like this, forced marriage or honour killing or anything like that. I did not bring this up to make a comparison. My point is that the argument that the parents think it's an honour means less than nothing, which is why I'm baffled at people using it for a justification, because it makes it more insidious, not less. So, baby snatchers? I would not go that far, but they are this close. And here comes the justification portion of the section, because the Jedi and their defenders insist that this is necessary. It's not. First of all, we know it's not necessary to take them in so young for training purposes because one of the greatest Jedi ever known didn't start his training until he was an adult. So the point of taking them in so young is so that they don't have time to form any worldviews separate from what the Jedi teach. And if that doesn't sound sinister and cultish to you, then I'm a little bit worried. And would like to ask you to watch out for people knocking on your door asking if you've heard the good news. Another reason they take them so young is so that attachments on the child's part can be severed easier. And we're going to look at the merits of attachments and the damage both breaking them and not learning how to properly form them can be when we get to the relationship with emotion is psychotic section. But just to touch upon it in relation to this point. We can talk about Anakin's fall to the dark side all day long. I probably will at some point in time. But if we're following the whole Chosen One prophecy narrative, which I actually think is quite clever considering how it plays out, he fulfills his destiny of bringing balance to the Force by killing the Emperor, and he does it because of his attachment to his child. Tell me again that the Jedi are raising their children this way for good reasons. And I have to say, one thing about Star Wars writing up until very recently that has quite honestly disturbed me a little bit is how they portray giving up a child as no big deal, instead of how damaging it can be for both parties. Because hey, the kid's gonna be a Jedi, that's better than a parental bond. How terrible a thing the Jedi are doing in this regard can come down to an outdated understanding on the creator's part of mental health and child rearing. Not that I think that's his fault, by the way. But however it came about, it's here now. So unless we want to change the Jedi's entire outlook, we're stuck with this no attachment thing. And in a modern context, this is not only a horrendous way to raise a child, it is outright abusive. It is now very well known that the early years of a child's development are critical, and if those stages are interrupted, it can be very hard to catch up. This is a time when children need to form healthy attachments. 1, to keep them safe in their vulnerable years, and 2, so that they can recognise healthy attachments when they grow up and learn how to form them properly. It's the reason we see people who were abused as children either become abusers themselves or get into abusive relationships. They were never taught what healthy attachments should look like. Of course, none of these are hard and fast rules. It does come down to the individual as well, but the pattern is undeniable. Now, I know people will be swearing to high heaven that the Jedi don't emotionally abuse their children. They're the good guys. They're just trying to stop them falling to the dark side, and I have things to say about the dark side. We'll get there. But in regards to this, the most common reasons people fall to the dark side, both in our world and Star Wars, seem to be irreconcilable ideological differences, the allure of power, and repeated exposure to trauma. But no, attachment is the dangerous thing you need to get rid of. I don't see them proactively tackling ideological infighting by creating a more open space for communication and free exchange of ideas. Are they going to stop sending their members into traumatic situations? Of course they're not. But considering their humanitarian work, I wouldn't expect them to. And I certainly don't see them giving up their power, either the ones bestowed on them by the Force or the ones given to them by their position. But no, attachment is the thing that needs to be disposed of. Now, everyone believes they know how the Force works. And I've talked a little bit about how I find adherence to the author a quite unfulfilling way of consuming any kind of entertainment. But it goes doubly so here because the Force is the subject of religion, ideology, philosophy, and even morality in terms of its appropriate usage. So not only do I think those are things no one, creator or no, should have a monopoly on the interpretation of, because remember the oops I wrote a rape scene story? Writers are human and can be wrong even if it is their world. And even if they're not wrong, that doesn't discount other interpretations from being viable as well. But also, these four are extremely complex concepts that no one can cover in their entirety. So even if you believe you adhere to the author completely, even if you have listened to and read every single word George Lucas has ever produced, you will still have a different interpretation on the Force than he will. It's just the nature of the human mind. That's why I think adherence to the creator is not only limiting, it's futile. And the slightly smug tone of, oh well, you see, this opinion is just down to a fundamental misinterpretation of the Force and how Star Wars works. I make YouTube videos for a living. I have total and complete comprehension of all angles of theology, philosophy, morality, and other concepts of limitless scope. These things are meant to be debated. And I think these are the kind of debates where no one person should come out being completely right. Because my personal philosophy, just mine by the way, is that all of these and all their sects have their value. And all have their fallibilities. No one point of view can cover every situation. And the key to living a good life is to always remember that. So back to the point, I find the idea of getting rid of attachments preposterous under any circumstance, but let's just say it's an indisputable fact that attachments increase the potential of falling to the dark side. They certainly don't mean every single person is going to fall to the dark side, it just simply increases the potential of it. Fixing that problem by getting rid of attachments altogether, to my ear, kind of sounds like saying this.
This dish requires a little extra salt, so I'm going to fuck it.
You may have solved the problem, but you've also made everything worse. But as we've laid out, removing attachments from children has been proven to be incredibly damaging. This is not just some wild psychological theory your hippie aunt might send you a link to. This is what is known to be true. Though the research is incomplete, though research is never complete, it's always evolving, that's how any science works, but psychologists have proven again and again that attachments are vital to a child's healthy mental development. And the removal of them is not just going to hurt the child's feelings or whatever, it is genuinely, emotionally, and sometimes irreparably damaging. Take the still face experiment for just one example.
As part of a study of how infants learn to interact with others.
The baby's happily interacting with her mother, but what happens when the mother stops interacting with her?
See, at first, the baby looks puzzled. She reaches for her to get her attention, but she doesn't respond. She smiles at her. Now, the baby looks hurt, but she keeps smiling.
As if she's saying, look, I'm here.
Yes, the baby is more and more distressed But she keeps trying, keeps smiling. And in the continued absence of response, helplessness creeps in, and despair. The baby is left terribly alone.
The baby endured 57 seconds of rejection.
Would have kept smiling, kept reaching out, not for seconds, for months, for years. She would have kept trying until her natural affections were burnt out. Most psychiatrists, they see these children as untreatable.
I reiterate, you absolute fucking bastards. I'm pretty sure that this was not the creator's intent, but this is an inescapable truth. So again, unless we want to scrap the Jedi's belief system entirely, we're stuck with this. And one other little justification I came across recently, which I found both frustrating and amusing in equal measure, was the argument that attachment means something different in the Star Wars universe. And the only thing I can say to that is, if we have to start changing the meaning of words to make what the Jedi are doing look better, then that kind of says a lot about how bad what they're doing is. So yeah, that's an argument, and again, I do not mean to sound like a freaking bitch here, but that isn't an argument that I can even find it in myself to respect, let alone understand. Attachment means something different, really? Is there any other narrative reason for a word to change its meaning in an entire universe? Not just a word, a concept. A concept vital to the human experience. Is there any other reason for changing it other than making the Jedi look better? Or even making the Jedi look like not monsters? And I know individual Jedi do form some level of attachment to people, particularly those they take under their care, because of course they do, they're people, but that is not what the Order says you're supposed to do. And even if you do end up attached, you have to let it go. Not just let it go so you can accept the inevitability of either death or someone moving on or leaving your life. No, that is genuinely an emotionally healthy lesson to teach. No, if you have an attachment, you should let it go. All attachment is forbidden. That's why they can't get married, that's why they can't have children. And whether the Jedi see this as their duty to the wider galaxy and that's why it has to come before any one person, hear me. Please, if you have a child, either by birth or by choice, you had better damn sure be ready to make that child the centre of your world. And if the Jedi can't do that, the Jedi should not be raising children. And this whole attachment thing is just the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. I can't speak for any other species in Star Wars, but humans are social creatures. Everyone with a brain knows that having healthy attachments is a vital component to living a mentally healthy life, even well into your adulthood. So, for people to point to Anakin as proof that attachment leads to the dark side, no. The Jedi's absolutism concerning this topic and failure to teach their children to form healthy bonds, well, I would definitely not go so far as to say it's responsible for the crime, but its fingerprints are all over the scene. It focuses on unhealthy attachments and the traumatic, upsetting breaking of bonds leading to the dark side, and ignores all the good things attachment does. Think of all the wonderful things people have done because of their attachment to another person. This is the dictionary definition of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And just the thought of those babies in identical cots tended to by a machine, no one to lean over them and talk nonsense to them daily to make them laugh, no one to snuggle with them, to tumble with them on the floor, tickle them, no one to kiss them goodnight even if they're already asleep. It's monstrous. That is reason alone for me personally to hate this organisation. You can't get attached to children? Don't have them. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And not only do I find this unjustifiable, I have absolutely no reason why anyone would want to justify this. I know people love the Jedi, and despite my vitriol in this video, I am by no means trying to make anyone feel badly about that. You can love something without justifying the horrendous things it's associated with. I love the Mandalorians, but I'm not about to start defending the Neo-Crusades. You can love the Jedi without defending blatant child abuse. So for my sanity, because I know that is of utmost importance to everyone watching, please stop trying to make this okay. This is not okay. And as we've stated before, this is specifically the inciting reason as to why I hate the Jedi, but oh, there are more.
An empire toppled by its enemies can rise again. But one which crumbles from within, that's dead. Forever.
Now, I think this is one most people will be familiar with, as the writers of the Clone Wars TV show definitely leaned into it. But, as with most issues concerning the Jedi, I think I looked upon it in a far less sympathetic fashion than most people did. So to set it up, just on the off chance you've never seen the Clone Wars TV show, the Republic is complicated to say the least, which I think is what put a lot of people off of the prequels, but it is very applicable to our own world, and the writers of the TV show definitely did an amazing job expanding and carefully explaining through quite tense political arcs what was going on and why this was all happening. In fact, I do think a lot of people are of the opinion that this TV show retrospectively improved the prequels, at least to some extent. And I can get behind that, not that I ever hated the prequels to begin with, but I did start to find what George Lucas was doing in those films significantly more interesting. So, just to simplify it as much as I can, the Republic is basically a collection of worlds that is beholden to a set of laws and standards as is voted for by said Republic. And the reason the war started, and again, I think most people would have an easier time describing why the Great War started than why the Clone War started.
So, where is Bosnia again?
But here we go. As I said, the way the political system is set up mirrors our own world, but that also means it mirrors it in the bad ways. So corruption, exploitation, and complacency are rife here. So a lot of the smaller, less powerful, less valuable worlds, despite being full members of the Republic, weren't receiving the same benefit and, quite frankly, safety that the Republic was supposed to provide them. So they thought that they would be better on their own. And you can't blame them, because you think, I'm paying taxes to this organisation and I am getting basically nothing in return. And just an example of one world was the world of Jibim that was left to slavers, bandits, and poverty because it wasn't really worth the Republic's notice. Until they discovered ore on their planet, very valuable natural resource, and then the Republic were all over them like flies around shit. So they placed heavy regulations and rules around what the Jibim people were able to do with their own natural resource. So very understandably, they were like, and that is just the story of one world. Every world had its own specific reasons for wanting to leave the Republic, but there is a running theme going through most of them. And at some point, the independent nations decided to make a droid army in order to safeguard said independence, and the rise of the droid army gave rise to the clone army, again, severely manipulated by the Sith and Count Dooku. And I think the best way to describe the powder keg moment is this.
It was just too much effort not to have a war.
And the Jedi found out that the Sith were involved, so instead of being the peacekeeping diplomats they claim they are, Sith. So we gotta fight. Instead of looking at the very valid and very, not only justifiable, but sympathetic reasons that these people wanted to get away from this goddamn Republic. And we know that they didn't, because Ahsoka says this.
I don't understand any of it. I know the Separatists are evil.
They didn't teach their Padawans the actual reason they were fighting this war. So either the Jedi didn't know the reasons these Separatists had for wanting to get away from the Republic, and as a result didn't bother to find out, great peacekeeping diplomats that they are, or they did know and just didn't care. I'll let you decide which one's worse. And here comes justification time. So, I'm going to get the first justification out of the way pretty quickly because I'm going to be diving further into it in the next section. So, it basically boils down to, well, they had to get involved because the Sith were behind the Separatists and the Sith are a proven evil. Now, I'm going to say something that was said to me, that was said to my parents, and I will say to my children should I ever have them. I don't care what the Sith's mommy lets them do, we're talking about your behaviour. Just let's say for argument's sake that they had to fight this war because of the Sith. The Jedi are supposed to be peacekeeping monks who purport to be an unbiased source of reason who can protect people and help others come to a peaceful democratic solution. Because as I said, do they even consider the Separatists' reasons for wanting to leave the Republic? No, they just say, oh, the Sith are behind them. That means they're evil. Great peacekeeping work there, guys. Honestly, just Nobel Prize worthy there. The argument that they had to, again, bears no merit for me because they made themselves beholden to the Republic through short-sightedness, negligence, and arrogance. And it just makes me laugh, this scene in Revenge of the Sith where they are so put out that the Chancellor is trying to muscle in on their council because they want the separation of church and state. Which is a real shame considering how they attached their church to the fucking state. Who'd have thunk that a religious organisation joining up with a political power was a bad idea? I mean, the Jedi are very anti-power and personal gain, it's their whole beef with the Sith. They were arrogant enough to think that it wouldn't affect them, that they could get into bed with politicians, live off their money, even enter their war and still keep their hands clean. And since this happens every day, it wouldn't bother me so much if it weren't for the high-mindedness and the fact that they preach a standard of morality they don't uphold. If the Jedi were politicians, I wouldn't be expecting any better from them. But as is the case with many issues I have here, it's not just the issue itself. It's the fact that I expect better because the Jedi tell us that they're better. Their attachment to the Republic means they are severely hampered in their humanitarian work, not just in wartime, but in general. I mean, take the situation on Mandalore where someone calls out to the Jedi for help and they're like, sorry, we can't help you because you're not in the club.
Without involvement from the Separatists, this is an internal affair for the Mandalorians. I'm afraid we cannot help.
Now, one justification that I could genuinely get behind was the idea that thanks to the Republic, there hasn't been a full-scale intergalactic war for 1,000 years, so the Republic basically justifies its existence through that. And I genuinely get that, even though I do think the argument itself is a bit short-sighted, which I'll explain in a minute, but kind of like how the European Union exists today, it was created to stop Europe collapsing in on itself for a third time. So despite the fact that it has many problems, then there is still a very legitimate reason for being in favour of it. And that was kind of the Jedi's way of thinking. They thought that the Republic was a stabilising influence on the galaxy. To a certain extent it was. And yeah, that's one that we found one. We found one that I can genuinely get behind. We did it. But.
I think you're confusing peace with quiet.
because it completely ignores the fact that war is not the only evil. What about corruption? What about exploitation? Poverty? Disease? And also it says there wasn't a full-scale intergalactic war for 1,000 years, doesn't take into consideration smaller wars and skirmishes that go on, so it didn't even get rid of war altogether, just what we would consider a world war, a galactic war. But again, I do still genuinely believe that that is still, despite all the other problems, a legitimate reason for being in favour of the Republic. Nobody wants a world war. It's just like people in Star Wars, nobody wants an intergalactic war. But I do think people who make this argument are not taking into consideration the fact that war is not the only evil, and also the fact that it doesn't even stop all wars, it just stops the big ones. And the final justification we come to is one that I can understand on a surface level, but when I look past that surface level, I just think... And that is, why are you blaming the Jedi for their own downfall? They were tricked by the Sith. They were outmaneuvered by the bad guys. Why are you blaming them? Okay. Imagine that we heard that excuse from our politicians, our military leaders, our faith leaders, all of which to a certain extent the Jedi are all three. Imagine that. Imagine one of these three came out and said, yeah, I know there was like a massive loss of life and loads of mistakes were made, but I didn't know. It's not my fault.
I want to apologise. It is so ridiculous. Didn't realise. I was also furious. And that is why we doubled down. Can't you see why the public think he's lying through his teeth? We're sticking to our plan. We're sticking to our plan. It's a plan with or without a plan. We're following it and we're going to stick to it.
So again, this is an argument I can kind of understand on a surface level because I think a lot of people's fondness for the Jedi Order is specifically tied to the individual Jedi characters that they genuinely love. So, of course you're going to feel sympathy when the Order falls. But the Jedi are a powerful religious organisation with very strong political ties who run a military. Better should have been expected of them. So this, oh, the poor Jedi were hoodwinked argument, my response to that?
Don't give me that shite!
So to close out this segment, do I take issue with the Jedi quashing very justified pushes for independence from societies who were being exploited so they could more conveniently further their war against space ISIS? Yeah, I very much take issue with that.
The vibrations of old mistakes never die. They follow you. If God's warnings are not heeded, then God summons you in person.
There's such a thin line between faith and delusion. Where does faith end and where does delusion start, you know? Where do you draw the line?
This one is going to take a lot of work. Now, religion is a subject of endless fascination to me, and like most lapsed Catholics, I did go through a religion is evil phase in my mid-teens, but I got over that pretty quickly when I started thinking and acting like an adult. I have enormous amounts of respect for people whose devotion to their faith informs their lives in fulfilling ways and makes them better people. Makes them the people they are, really. But I still haven't fully gotten over my dislike and distrust of religious organisations. And the reason I'm explaining this is because I promised I was going to lay all my biases on the table so you can see why I reacted so strongly to some of these things and judge my point of view accordingly. Many individual Jedi, whatever flaws they may have, are informed by their faith in the Jedi way of life and code of conduct, and are good people as a result of their adherence to and unique interpretations of it. And let's not kid ourselves, the best and most moral Jedi do hold to their beliefs, but not with the kind of dogmatic stubbornness that leaves room for nothing else. and also are more in tune with their faith than listening to whatever decisions or orders the council arbitrarily hands down. But the Jedi Order is a religious order, and if anyone has an argument that the Jedi don't count as a religious order in the same way, no, this is not an artistic interpretation. They are the dictionary definition of a religious order. They have a doctrine, they have rituals, they have a church, they have leaders of that church, and before they became generals, they did what amounted to religious missionary work as keepers of the peace. They are a church. And the reason I object to religious organizations so much is because any organization is ripe for corruption, especially powerful ones. It only takes a few bad apples to spoil the barrel, and protecting the organization always becomes more important than protecting people the organization has hurt, or even just doing what is right. And that is bad enough for any organization, but when you are dealing with people's faith, that becomes inherently more dangerous. But the Jedi being a religious order is not the reason I take issue with them, it just compounds the situation. Again, just giving you my biases here. My issue is their multiple millennia long battle with the Sith. Now, I find myself both fascinated and inherently frustrated with Star Wars because it is a franchise with galaxy-spanning stories that have so much nuance and intelligent looks into the human soul and questions about morality from points of view of different cultures and species. They want to have that nuance. George Lucas wanted that nuance with all the political machinations in the prequels, but alongside that moral complexity and greyness, they still want to have a light and a dark side. Now, I would go more into this, but the justifications for the dark side being just bad, beyond it being the dark side, which I don't accept as being enough because I'm not 6, are all very varied and often contradictory. Like I said, nobody completely agrees or knows how the Force works. In my opinion, that's the point of it being a metaphysical being that's the subject of religion, ideology, philosophy, and morality. There is no one right way. But so as not to clog up this video any further, I will just be taking it for granted that dark equals bad, even though I really don't want to. Morality is an endless spectrum. So do let me know if you'd like to hear my thoughts on that in another video. Another argument I see quite frequently is that the narrative is supposed to be an old-fashioned good versus evil fairy tale. And if the original trilogy were all that existed, I would agree. I wouldn't be making this video. I wouldn't even care about Star Wars. But the prequels added context to the Jedi. It added politics to the war. It added shades of reality into what was previously just good guys and bad guys. The Clone Wars TV show took it even further in this direction by displaying the flaws of the Republic, the negligence of the Jedi, the severe mistakes of the heroes, and the injustice of the actions good characters take. And I have a lot of trouble with this argument and the dark is bad, light is good argument in general, because it's like painting a black and white picture, adding splashes of colour, and then trying to convince me it's still black and white. You can't do that. So the dark side is just evil argument never really sat well with me, but for the sake of this video, we're just going to be focusing on the Sith, because that makes things so much simpler. So let's take it at face value that the Sith are just evil by nature of being Sith. Let's say the actions you have to take to become a Sith make you evil by any decent moral code, which it does. Let's say the Sith are the Star Wars version of ISIS. Let's say they've taken what is a peaceful ideology, picked certain parts of it, and warped it into their own gruesome image for the sake of gaining power and beating down anyone who objects to their rise. The Jedi's fault in this regard comes down to how they consistently react to it and never evolve in how they tackle the issue. The initial Sith were formerly Jedi who were, in a sense, radicalized, and instead of these peacekeepers finding a, God forbid, peaceful solution, they engage in all-out religious warfare. If we look at how young people are radicalized today, there's always something that pushes them towards it rather than being just evil. Though the heady feelings of having power can intoxicate people and make it hard to come back. So they would, in a sense, have become Sith by that point. And yes, we need to fight radical groups like this. They are committing acts of atrocity to those who can't fight back or don't join them. Fighting in the physical sense is very important, especially when these groups gain traction and become powerful. Hi, just a quick note from the editing room here, because while I was putting this together, I did see that it could come across like I am comparing the Jedi to the Nazis here, because one far-right group kind of rises to meet the other. That's not what I meant. I do not like the Jedi, but they are not Nazis. The reason I included them is twofold. One, because I wanted to express that extremists are all the same. Their motivations, their actions, their attitudes, their tactics. The only thing that separates these people is ideology. And two, while I do think the historical Sith have a lot more in common with ISIS, the Empire was modelled on the OG Nazis. I mean, Star Wars is not a subtle series at the best of times, but this was one of those things that was particularly on the nose, and it was meant to be. In fact, when Palpatine comes down that ramp in Revenge of the Sith, I half expected a stormtrooper to start singing "Springtime for the Sith and Palpatine." So yeah, that's why I included them both, that's why they're here. Glad we cleared that up. Back to the show. But you know what's just as important, maybe even more so when it comes to stopping wars? Is communities with open communication and non-judgmental faith leaders that can lead vulnerable young men and women onto a better path before radicalisation and de-radicalisation. The tireless work of boots-on-the-ground religious leaders, teachers, and even law enforcement are essential to stopping all-out ideological and religious war from breaking out, or stopping it when it does. I don't blame the Jedi for fighting the Sith, they need to be fought. But instead of taking the human approach, as even we in our backwards primitive little planet at least try to do, even if the leaders that start and perpetuate these wars consistently fail and, as I said previously, deserve to be taken to task for their failure. What do the Jedi do? They sit there in their literal ivory tower, passing judgment and dealing in absolute. Yes, Obi-Wan, only the Sith do that. They say, the Sith is evil, this is our way is good, and if anyone becomes dark, it's because they didn't follow our way. They are the problem.
I think the Count Dooku is behind it.
You know, milady, Count Dooku was once a Jedi. He couldn't assassinate anyone.
No need to look at ourselves as an organisation and understand how we may have failed. There is nothing wrong here. There couldn't possibly be anything wrong with us. No, of course, if anyone falls to the dark side, it's due to them not listening to you. Not pushing detachment and shame on your people and failing to teach them to form healthy bonds. Not being so arrogant and sure that you're right that people become disillusioned with your bullshit. No, there is absolutely no reason for you to look inward and see that there might be a problem with the way you do things. An all-encompassing justification I often hear for everything the Jedi do is that they need to do it because they are necessary in order to fight the Sith. You say the Jedi are a force for good because they are necessary to solve a problem they spawned. That is not to take away from the individual and the choices they make. Someone slaughters a bunch of children, they do not get to stand in front of a court and say, the Jedi treated me this way, that's why I did it. No, the buck stops with the individual. But the wider collective still has to look inward and see how this happened and how they can stop it from happening again. Because if they don't, it will. And tightening your control doesn't work. It very often has the opposite effect.
The more you tighten your grip, Tarkin, the more star systems will slip through your fingers.
That is the kind of thing I think a lot of people find difficulty with when it comes to this argument. They think blame has to fall one way or the other. It's very often both. And after all these centuries of fighting the Sith and being so dead set on the idea that the Sith are just an evil that needs to be purged from the galaxy, they haven't bothered to actually see the Sith as human beings and re-examine their own actions. Although, I guess we should be thankful because anytime the Jedi do change, they've just made themselves worse. So to close out this point, I find the concept of the inherent goodness of the Jedi quite disconcerting because it means you have created religious teachings where there is an indisputable right way.
I was a totally strict and devout Protestant. I thought we went to heaven. Yes, well, I'm afraid you were wrong. I was a practicing Jehovah's Witness. You picked the wrong religion as well. Well, who was right? Who gets into heaven? I'm afraid it was the Mormons. Yes, the Mormons were the correct answer.
The Sith and the Jedi are not the only followers of the Force. Just off the top of my head, there's the Witches of Dathomir on the dark side and the Disciples of the Wills on the light. You're telling me that nope, all other sects are wrong, the Jedi are right. That in and of itself I find quite wrong, but again, let's go with the idea that the Sith are space ISIS and their way of doing things cannot under any tolerable circumstance be allowed to continue. That still does not put the Jedi completely in the right. It brings up the quite insidious argument that you have to do things the Jedi way. You have to obey. You have to detach. Because if you don't, look what happens.
Oh, it's love. See, this is what love looks like. Love warns, okay? Love doesn't just let people go to hell or walk them hand in hand to the gates of hell.
You guys say that you can do anything you want to do and it's all right? What's wrong with this world? Freedom of choice.
You're guilty of disobedience.
Some hellfire brimstone preachers to tell you to get right.
A terrifying thing to fall.
It'll cost you your soul.
This is the truth.
You see why some Star Wars fans might take issue with the whole the Jedi are just right, deal with it argument? Because when you are dealing with religion and ideology, that is a very dangerous and, to most decent people, a very unappealing position to hold. You don't want to become that, do you? So of course we are right. Because look what we're fighting. There is good and there is bad. And they are so obviously bad, so what we're doing is automatically good. If we do things that may seem inhumane or cruel, we do them because we have to fight the bad. We're trying to stop the bad taking hold of you. So many people see the Jedi as the embodiment of spiritual good, but to my eyes, they're Christian crusaders in Buddhist robes.
If an item does not appear in our records, it does not exist.
We have prepared an inoculation for every clone trooper in our army.
So, I guess it's over then.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Every word of what you just said is wrong.
Now, this section isn't going to have a justification portion because I don't really see very many people justifying these things, except for the negligence, and we'll get to that in the final section. No, this is just going to be a series of oopsies that the Jedi have made over the years, and I've limited myself to 3 because if I didn't, I would be here for a while. This is a very, very small sample of all the shit they've pulled. So the 3 things we're going to be looking at are Jango Fett and the Hutt Mando'Adi, General Grievous, and Ahsoka Tano.
Always a pleasure to meet a Jedi.
Can we all agree that Lucas's decision to make Jango Fett not a Mandalorian was dumb? Quick note, by the way, no hate to George Lucas. This is clearly a very creative and dedicated man who puts his whole heart into things and has seriously received a lifetime's worth of unjustified hate. My favourite descriptor of him as a director is, George Lucas is a man who somehow manages to achieve the impossible while botching the basics. Like I said, he is human, and humans make dumb decisions. George makes them frequently.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground!
And that is another reason why I maintain that, especially in collaborative art forms like film and TV, it doesn't matter who originally created the thing. Better ideas should be accepted, even if they didn't come from the original mind. When it comes to this Jango Fett Mandalorian thing, thank God they retconned that. Or unretconned that. For those who don't know, Jango Fett was a foundling taken in by the leader of a group of Mandalorians called the Hutt Mandoade, or the True Mandalorians. If you know about the pacifist Mandalorians and their ideological conflict with Death Watch, think of the Hutt Mandoade as the political moderates. Jango Fett's adoptive father, Jaster Muriel, is a really interesting guy with some really great ideas about maintaining the Mandalorians' warrior culture, but having it be more guided by honour for a stronger but still stable and functioning society. Honestly, this guy is just like the daddy Mandalorian. Like, he is just most underrated Star Wars character. I'm calling it right now. And I'm glad that they've kind of canonized him, so I hope we get to learn more. But yeah, anyway, I could go on all day. Just, yeah, this guy's amazing. But all you really need to know is that he wrote something called the Super Commando Codex, which really just demanded a higher standard of behaviour from his Mandalorian warriors while still maintaining their warrior way. So after Jaster died, Jango took over the True Mandalorians, and they were hired by this guy who wanted them to take down political insurgents, but it turns out he was actually working with Death Watch, and at the behest of the leader of Death Watch, who want to get rid of the True Mandalorians, he calls the Jedi, says that the True Mandalorians are slaughtering his people and could they please come and help. And of course, the Jedi, being the great peacekeepers and responsible humanitarians that they are, do a great amount of research, make sure their facts are correct, and end up finding out that the True Mandalorians have a legal contract with the governor. No, of course they don't. They go in and slaughter them. Yep. No research. No chit-chat. No nothing. Yeah, the Nobel Prize nominations here just keep racking up, don't they? And this is the incident that turns Jango Fett into a famed Jedi killer who slaughters 6 of them with his bare hands, who would then go on to create millions of other Jedi killers who basically make them extinct. Georgie boy, why? Oh why, oh why, oh why would you want to get rid of that kind of poetry?
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
Because you somehow thought it would make him a better character if he wasn't Mandalorian? I'm having some real trouble trying to think exactly why Lucas thought this was good characterization. I mean, just from a purely technical writing standpoint, not a what would be cooler, what would be more Star Wars, this and that. No, just purely from a writing standpoint. Why was this better? For this, you wanted to wipe out a beautiful backstory, get rid of an entire sect of Mandalorians who are arguably more interesting than the pacifists and the Death Watch put together. This also being the instance that cements Count Dooku's disillusionment with the Jedi Order and the culling of an entire sect of Mandalorians who arguably had the chance to change the Mandalorian civil war for the better. And this was all woven in by Palpatine because he knows that a strong and unified Mandalore was potentially the only thing that could stand up to his new empire. And you just wiped that all out? And not to mention the very Batman-esque cautionary tale of creating your own enemies that the Jedi really should have heeded by now. Why? Okay, enough of Lucas's questionable choices. Let's get back to talking about the Jedi's questionable choices.
Listen to me, Jedi. I do not care about your politics. I do not care about your republic. I only live to see you die.
I think one of the biggest failings of the Clone Wars TV show, which is really bloody good by the way, is their portrayal of General Grievous. I know a lot of people were kind of disappointed that he wasn't as intimidating and competent as he was in the extended material, and that is definitely true. But my problem is that they pretty much ignored his entire backstory. And they do that quite a bit for bad guys who don't eventually become good or grey guys. But to put it in its simplest possible terms, Grievous was a member of a warrior culture by name of the Kaleesh who were constantly under siege by a race they called the Huck, a race of bug-like aliens who were enslaving them. They reached out to the Republic for help, but I'm sure you can guess how that turned out without me having to tell you. Or you can just imagine their plea got lost in the mail somewhere. So the Kaleesh with Grievous, or Kaiman Jai Shilal as he was known, amazingly managed to drive them out with nothing more than low-tech weapons, sheer warrior skill and force of will. But they didn't stop with just taking their homeworld and enslaved people back. They knew they would be forever in danger from their slavers who still had considerable intergalactic power, and they certainly couldn't count on help from the Republic or anyone else for that matter, should the Huck try again. So they started taking the colonies the Huck created. But they were also committing genocide against the bugs, which is never okay, and when said bugs reached out to the Republic for help because they were a much more powerful world that the Republic thought was worthy of its notice, sent the Jedi to help. So of course the Jedi do their research and are the good humanitarians that they claim to be. No, of course they don't. They just take their orders from the Republic, put down Grievous's rebellion without a thought, imposing heavy taxation on the Kaleesh homeworld, putting them back in a subservient position and causing mass starvation on their planet. Nice. And just one more thing before we go on. People who are so desperate for the Jedi to remain the good guys, when it comes to instances like this, try to blame it all on the Republic. Please stop babying the Jedi Order. You act like they're in the position the clones were, completely powerless through none of their own doing. When the Jedi do these horrendous things, I see a lot of people saying, well, there was no good option, they just made the best of a bad situation. One, there are usually a lot more options open to the Jedi than a lot of people like to paint there as being. 2, they are not slaves. And 3, even if they are bound to obey the Republic, that is the problem, and it's their own fault. They made themselves beholden to the Republic by their own will, and they remain beholden to the Republic by their own will. So even if the Order had no choice, it's their own damned fault they've got no choice. You do not get to walk yourself into a bad situation, be presented with crappy choices, and then say, well, I made the best of a bad situation, when you created the situation. Please stop babying the Jedi Order and hold them responsible for themselves. The Republic has its own blame to bear, oh boy does it, but their involvement does not mitigate the Jedi's responsibility. Now, I am not doing this character justice with just his culture, his mindset, his religion, his lost love, his basically selling himself to the Separatists so his people could be free, slowly and non-consensually becoming a cyborg, losing the great warrior he once was. It is ancient Greek levels of tragic. Please, if you haven't done already, go read up on General Grievous. I am begging you. But that was scrapped for the show because, understandably, having your heroes aid in the subjugation of a people they considered primitive through their own arrogance and prejudice is not exactly a good look. Now, I am not defending Grievous. He is a bad dude. At one point, he aids in the capture of Force-sensitive younglings for a project to turn them into cyborgs just like him. He is not a good person. But once you know his history and where he came from, his little hobby of collecting lightsabers becomes infinitely more understandable.
I'm not going to take the fall for something I didn't do!
And another, possibly the most famous and egregious example of the Jedi's arrogance and negligence is how they dealt with Ahsoka Tano. The Jedi Temple was bombed and she was framed for that bombing. The Republic, to whom the Jedi are beholden by their own will, want to try Ahsoka in a Republic court, but in order to do that, she must first be expelled from the Order, because to make things even shadier, the Jedi cannot be tried in public courts. Where have we seen that before? But I guess it's perfectly okay for them to operate this way because the Jedi are the undisputed spiritual good of Star Wars. And of course, they act responsibly and investigate appropriately, and I couldn't even get through it that time. The only one who cares to do any investigation whatsoever is Anakin, and I think he puts it perfectly.
You've already made your decision, haven't you? This meeting is just a formality!
Yeah. There is no evidence, there are no witnesses, she doesn't have a defense. Every single member of the council just says how they feel about the situation. This is a kangaroo court. Great for those who claim to put their lives in service of democracy. And due to this negligence, they throw a young girl to the wolves to make themselves look good in the face of the Republic. And when the truth is revealed, Master Plo Koon is the only one who freaking apologizes to her. Mace Windu even has the gall to frame this as her great trial to become a knight. He's like, yeah, I see now. This all happened for a reason. This was your test of worth to become a Jedi Knight. So it's all okay. The Force works in mysterious ways. Okay. You betrayed this girl. Abandoned her to her fate without putting in the effort to actually find out what was going on, and you think letting her into your little ego club somehow makes up for it. And just to compound how ingrained this topsy-turvy view of how people should act is, just how cultish this organization is, there is a deleted scene where Obi-Wan and Anakin discuss Ahsoka leaving.
I will grant you mistakes were made, but she chose to leave. Part of the Jedi way is not letting emotion cloud your better judgment, and that's precisely what Ahsoka did.
Obi-Wan, I love you, but... The Order, being the only support network this child has ever known, discards her in order to make itself look unbiased, breaks every ounce of trust she had in them, contributes to one of the most traumatic events in her life, and maybe has some legitimate concerns about trusting them again when they have clearly shown they are not worthy of that trust, and you frame this as some kind of tantrum?
How well would you sleep knowing I failed you?
Yeah, she's the one being unreasonable here.
And this is called confirmation bias.
There is a reason people don't put their trust in those who have previously betrayed them. I'm not saying forgiveness should never happen, but yeah, that is the correct response to being betrayed. You ever had that friend who goes back to that partner or family member who is toxic and you want to scream at them, but their response is, if you love someone, you don't give up on them, or their family, as if that makes them obligated to dedicate their lives to people who objectively don't deserve it. Walking away is the right thing to do. And if it's not the Jedi way, then personally, I say the Jedi way is wrong.
I am the thing that keeps you up at night. The evil that haunts every dark corner of your mind. I will never rest, and neither will
you. Forgive me, but before we get into the nitty-gritty of this, I just want to bring up one wee thing because it makes me laugh and is illustrative of why I think the Jedi are emotionally disabled. It comes from Dave Wolverton's series of novels, Star Wars Jedi Apprentice, which concerns Obi-Wan's years as a Padawan. And Masters, including Master Qui-Gon Jinn, initially don't want him because of his apparent anger issues. You were angry with that other boy. I sensed anger in both of you. It is better not to train a boy to become a knight if he has so much anger. There is a risk he could turn to the dark side. He's 13! A 13-year-old boy has trouble regulating his emotions. I've never heard that before in my life. He must be approaching the dark side. Unless the dark side is a euphemism for puberty, which it very well could be, No. And I just want to say, Obi-Wan is being bullied in this book by another student, and he shows a remarkable amount of patience I would never expect to see in someone his age. Dark side my arse. Now, with the whole children thing, and the final topic I'll be discussing after this one, I really don't think there are any reasonable arguments in favour of them. It's child abuse and well, we'll get there. But with the other topics, they stray more into ideological territory. That doesn't mean they can't be argued against, but these points of view are going to be really dependent on someone's personal ideology and moral viewpoint when it comes to judging how valid they are. That is not the case for the first and last topic. Treating people like this is wrong by any moral code that wants to consider itself decent. But while the other topics disgust me the most, because of course they do, this is the one that keeps me awake at night. This freaking attachment thing. I know I touched upon it a little bit in the child section, but that was mostly just concerning how the withholding of attachments is abusive and damaging, especially in your formative years. This is the part where I just look at the merits of the idea on its own, and take a look at all the justifications I've heard for it. And strap in because there are a lot of them. Now, when writing this video, I tried my best to seek out other points of view because, well, despite how emphatic I have been here, I know my information is not complete. And considering my own personal philosophy of all points of view having merits and all points of view having drawbacks, it would be pretty hypocritical if I didn't do that. So I watched a few Jedi Defenders, and while I did find some views I considered questionable nutcases, there were many salient points of view I came across. One I came across was a YouTuber going through the 6th episode of the Book of Boba Fett and explaining with far greater patience than I've shown in this video that the Jedi are meant to be the guardians of the galaxy. That the Jedi are meant to be the selfless defenders of the galaxy, and they have to give up attachments because if you have someone you love with your whole heart, it becomes hard to put the galaxy before them. Which makes them sound more like Vulcans than compassionate peacekeepers, but that is a point of view I can genuinely get behind. If we liken it to joining the priesthood in a way, priests, at least in theory, have to give up their worldly possessions and the chance of love, marriage and family in order to serve God. And Luke is giving Grogu a choice here as to whether that's something he actually wants to do. Now that's good in theory, but we are still stuck with one major inescapable problem. We are ultimately still dealing with children. And I know I have become that lady.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
And you know something? I'll own that. I've seen all the arguments about selfishness versus selflessness, and I don't think anyone means to say this, but the Jedi, and by extension their defenders, are basically saying that a child's attachment to their parent is selfish. You know something? The Jedi were right. They were absolutely right. Emotion and attachment does lead to the dark side because I am seriously feeling the urge to force choke someone right now. I feel like I'm going crazy. I genuinely feel like I'm living in a world where someone can argue that a child's attachment to their parent is selfish and inherently dangerous enough that it has to be severed. Maybe this is just me. I am a filthy heathen. I have no spirituality in my heart. Maybe I am just too earthbound to get this, but I can't. I just can't. Passion, freedom, individual relationships, attachments are what it means to be alive. And yes, while people's passions can lead them towards doing bad things, they can also give them the motivation in order to do wonderful things. And this is kind of my all-encompassing issue with the Jedi and why I think they are full of shit.
Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
That's a lot of pit stops on the way to the dark side, isn't it? And I think you're missing a very key word there. Can. Fear can lead to anger. Anger can lead to hate. Hate can lead to suffering.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Oh, do they now? I could just so easily flip this argument on its head and say, fear can lead to survival. Anger can lead to catharsis. Even hate can lead to necessary action being taken. It's this inevitable cascade that I find so ludicrously indefensible. They talk about these things and practice them in absolutes.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
And I just want to take a minute to talk about failed Padawans, because when people bring up the whole attachment argument, they're mostly talking about knights and masters. I don't believe it's necessary for knights and masters either, but let's talk about people who aren't that. So, just on the off chance you're watching this and you don't know, if you don't get chosen by a master, you basically fail out and you get sent to one of the 4 Jedi service corps, which is the agricultural corps, the educational corps, the medical corps, and the exploratory corps. You're telling me that attachments are an inherently dangerous thing to have for people who are going to be farmers? Really? And I don't believe it's necessary for knights and masters either, because 1, not every problem is a trolley problem, and 2, especially in peacetime, how much is one individual Jedi's loved one's life going to come into conflict with their work as a Jedi? In realistic terms, in practical, applicable terms, how often is that going to happen? I suppose it's more likely to happen if you marry a partner who has a stake in the work you do, but that would then be a conflict of interest, and the Jedi could very reasonably then say, well, this relationship is going to come into conflict with your duties, so we're going to have to ask you to choose. I get that. And even though there is a point to be made about not wanting to sacrifice your loved ones for something greater than yourself or them, that again comes with the implication that no one, especially people born with duty in their heart, would ever do that, which is not an inevitability either.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
You can love someone more than the sun in the sky and still understand that the sun is more important than they are. Unless, of course, you have severe emotional problems. And have the strength to make that decision, especially if one or both partners are raised with duty in mind. And if someone is showing signs of not being able to do that, then we can have a conversation. The key is finding the right partner, something the Jedi obviously haven't given their children the tools to do. There are so many ways around this detachment rubbish, it drives me crazy. The Jedi are anti-life. They take children away from their families and raise them to believe that their lives are bound in service to a greater good.
Shut it!
And even they fail at delivering that greater good because they are detached. Because if you are detached, truly detached, you lose the ability to understand and relate to the people you've detached yourself from. You know, the people you're supposed to be protecting. Whenever the Jedi have committed a wrong or made a mistake, I feel as though I can point to it and say, maybe a little bit of attachment might have helped you make a better choice in this situation. Another pretty decent and quite interesting argument I came across was the fundamental difference in ideology. I came across a YouTuber who theorised that a lot of people's visceral reaction to the no attachment thing is due to our Western individualistic consumerist mindset. And I would like to attest that I think he is both right and wrong. Right in the fundamental sense that the point is correct, but wrong in the sense that it is missing so much, as is the case for a lot of justifications I find here. In theory, sounds good. In practice, not so much. I feel as though I can speak to this topic in particular because I used to live in Japan, a very group-oriented, greater good mindset country. I have friends who live over there, and I have Japanese friends who live here in Glasgow. So I just want to say that in this particular section, everything is still My opinion, just gleaned from the conversations I've had with them over the years. And yes, my friends who live in Japan take a look at this situation and say, I don't see what's so bad about this. Why does this bother you so much? And I say, I can't tell you. Because I would need a fully written, fully edited 2-hour-long YouTube video to do it. You're welcome. But my friends who live here, who, by the way, are way on the liberal end of the scale for Japanese people, but whose views would be considered pretty unremarkable in this country, agree with me, or at least see where I'm coming from. They are significantly older than me, they have lived all over the world, so yeah, we're all about the biases and lived experiences here. So I think a lot of Western people have a very romanticized view of this greater good, group-centered, and to use this word completely wrong, Zen mindset. But don't get me wrong, there's a lot of good to be had from that. For example, the crime rates over there are so low. I mean, obviously, it really depends on where you live, but comparatively speaking, yeah, it's so much better over there. But there are also a lot of problems. A big example being the outrageous rates of suicide among young people caused by chronic overwork, which is another symptom of the group mindset. And I had a lot of really interesting conversations with my friends and colleagues over the years about our different approaches to work. Like, for example, and I'm not being hyperbolic here, in Japan, if you don't arrive like 15 minutes early and stay half an hour after your shift is finished, you are considered a bad worker. And my very Western individualist point of view was that if my employer gives me a task and a reasonable time frame in which to complete that task, and I can't do that, I have to arrive early and stay late to do my job, I am not a good worker. I am a bad worker. I mean, inefficient worker. And also we had conversations about what it means to be part of a team as well. From my Japanese colleagues and friends' point of view, being a good team member meant doing as much as you can by yourself in order to be as little of a burden on your team members as you possibly can be. Whereas again, my Western point of view was, if I were struggling, then my team member would help me. And if my team member was struggling, I would very happily be helping them. Like, we make up for each other's shortcomings because nobody can be perfect. We do things together. We're a team. So yeah, I had lots of really interesting conversations about the different mindsets concerning these kind of things. And I know that was a particularly long tangent, but I'm going to leave it in because it does kind of get to the heart of what I'm saying here. We have problems they don't, but they also have problems we don't. And according to my friends who are career freelance journalists, there's not only an apathy, but a growing outright hostility towards human rights in some places over there because, well, why would you need someone to advocate for you individually? There's the group to think about. So while we may think of this less individualistic approach being less selfish because you're not thinking about yourself, you're thinking about the group, take a minute and think about what actually happens when people adopt that mindset. Think about what happens when people put the needs of the abstract group above the needs of individual people. Often doesn't work out so well. So take it from someone who has seen both sides of the fence. The grass ain't greener on either side. But don't get me wrong here, there's nothing wrong with adopting a less individualistic mindset. As I've said, like everything, it has its merits and it has its drawbacks. It's just the absolutism and the insistence of some fans that the Jedi are ideologically right, full stop, nothing more to see, move along.
Hold on.
Yeah, and dictatorships function smoother than democracies, what's your point? Now, I disagree with the fact that it worked, but we'll get to that. But even if it did, it worked because, as I said much earlier in this video, the Jedi took children away from their families before they could form attachments or any worldviews separate from what the Jedi teach. So even if it did work, it was immoral as fuck. This is another one that I struggle to accept as any kind of justification, because how much something works has very little bearing on how ultimately right or wrong it is. Unless you are a die-hard utilitarian, and I'll be addressing that presently. There's a reason dictatorships and harsh regimes exist throughout all of human history. As a form of government, they work. And I just want you to think about something. Consider the history of the Kaminoans for a second, and how their planet is almost uninhabitable. And the reason they've become some of the greatest geneticists in the galaxy is because they had to do it to survive. And that's how they became the slave farming, killing their own babies if they have green eyes psychopaths that they are today. So, under this moral logic, you could go up to a Kaminoan and say, hey, eugenics is wrong. And they could say, yeah, but in the context of our society, it's necessary. There is a fundamental truth to that, but does it really alter the morality of eugenics? A lot of people who are very critical of the Jedi tend to say that they are just completely cold and heartless, and despite what side of the debate I fall down on, I think that is a gross oversimplification of them. However, the rebuttal to this argument lives in my brain. It is centered around this clip from Attack of the Clones, and it has been used more than once by more than one person to say, no, the Jedi are not heartless, and they are allowed to love, and they do know what love is, and they're not emotionally disabled. Take a look, and please God tell me you're hearing what I'm hearing.
Attachment is forbidden. Compassion, which I would define as unconditional love, is central to a Jedi's life. And so you might say that we are encouraged to love.
Compassion and love are not the same thing. I can feel compassion for people I don't love. I think most people can.
Compassion, which I would define as unconditional love.
Oh really, Anakin? That's how you would define it? Well, let's take a look at its actual definition. Sympathetic pity and concern for the sufferings or misfortunes of others. And though I hesitate to define love because, well, how do you define love? It's not just an emotion, it's a concept vital to the human experience. But I think the closest we're going to get is a deep feeling of affection for another person. But even with that woefully inadequate description, these two are not only not the same, they are barely similar. The only things they have in common is that they are emotions that are generally considered positive that are directed outward toward other people. Other than that, they have nothing in common. Compassion comes about by what a person has been through. Love comes about by who a person actually is. And while I can totally see the Jedi mistaking compassion for love, emotionally healthy adults in the audience just looking at this clip,
Compassion, which I would define as unconditional love,
and saying, yeah, that sounds right, mistaking compassion for love, that is quite concerning, because you know who does mistake compassion for love? Emotionally neglected children. If someone comes over to you and shows you compassion, they're not showing you love. Just the idea that not just someone, but several someones seem to think that compassion and love are the same thing? You see why this is the one that keeps me awake at night, right? Like, there are other justifications I've ran into that I've been like, God, really? That's a justification to you? But I've at least somewhat managed to see how they got from A to B. This one, I am flabbergasted. I'm dumbfounded. Boys and girls, I got nothing. And this is the argument that is used to say that the Jedi are not emotionally disabled, because far from making the argument, it breaks the argument. It's like saying, hey, those people know a lot about animals, why don't you go talk to them? I don't know, they don't seem like they would know a lot about animals. No, they do, listen to this. A cat, which I would define as a dog with an attitude. See? I reiterate, I got nothing. But another interesting point a lot of people bring up is that the Jedi have to live without attachments to remain serene and unbiased and be better able to make decisions that bring about the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. That is utilitarianism, which is an inherently dispassionate moral standpoint to take. So it's weird to say that the Jedi are an inherently compassionate people, and in the same breath say that their moral greatness comes about from their utilitarian viewpoint. Well, one, utilitarianism is not the greatest and only moral viewpoint to take. And as I said before, a lot of the things the Jedi do are pretty indefensible unless you are a die-hard utilitarian, which, and I don't say this with any snideness by the way, I don't think a lot of non-sociopaths are. And I want to take a minute and talk about Star Trek for a second. Now, I am not a Trekkie, but my dad and my granny definitely are, so I've been more than exposed. And I want to bring it up because they balance the utilitarian viewpoint and the compassionate viewpoint very well. Because yeah, utilitarianism, like all other moral viewpoints, does have its place. And Star Trek, in particular, has always been so good at posing moral and philosophical questions through the lens of sci-fi. In fact, sci-fi as a genre, Star Wars included, is quite possibly the best genre at doing that. And Star Trek does it very well through the characters of Spock and Bones, because Spock is all logic and Bones is all heart. And while Spock does more often than not get the last word, because in big picture situations the head should more often than not win out over the heart, it is very clearly illustrated that Bones' heart is equally important.
War is never imperative, Mr. Spock.
It is for them, Doctor. Vulcan, like Earth, had its aggressive, colonizing period. And if the Romulans retain this martial philosophy, then weakness is something we dare not show.
Do you want a galactic war on your conscience?
The point is them being two entirely separate yet necessary entities that are always at loggerheads with each other, and depending on the situation, one of them will win out over the other. But I feel like a lot of people who genuinely love the Jedi want to defend their callousness through the utilitarian moral lens, but at the same time don't want them to be seen as cold, so say that they're also compassionate. So which is it? Are they compassionate or are they utilitarian? And well, yes, we do see these two moral standpoints at war within individual Jedi characters. That's not what we're talking about. We are talking about the Jedi Order, which does have a doctrine and a set of moral standards and behaviours it expects its followers to abide by. And it is quite a utilitarian doctrine. So Jedi that go against it are kind of going against the doctrine. So yeah, I disagree with the assertion that the Jedi Order are compassionate, because in order for their detached utilitarian viewpoint to be applied, they can't be. And an in-universe example of this is the story of Count Dooku. And to just give you the highlights, Count Dooku was given to the Jedi Order at a young age by his father because his father hates Force sensitives. But Count Dooku went back to his home planet later in his life, met his sister, and formed some sort of relationship and correspondence with her, which the Jedi really didn't like. And then his mother died. And of course, having been abandoned by his family at an early age and never managing to resolve that with them in an emotionally healthy way, he very reasonably wants to go to the funeral to get some kind of closure. And the Jedi Order says, Yeah, we'll let you go, but you have to stop talking to your sister. Yeah, I can just feel the compassion rolling off them in waves. Now, despite being an offshoot of the it works argument, this is very interesting because there's a lot of back and forth that can be had about whose responsibility something is, the individual or the group. The answer is often both, but people are always going to come to their own conclusions about who holds the greatest level of responsibility and what should be done about it, if anything, and every individual circumstance is different. I am more inclined to call out the group because, despite believing that the buck stops with the individual, their responsibility kind of goes without saying. Organisations, however, get away with so much crap and hardly ever face any consequences for it. So yeah, that's another bias of mine. I am naturally more inclined to call out the group. 1, because I think it needs to be done more, and 2, because it is a very interesting thing to think about. I mean, how do you hold a non-sentient entity like an order, a group, or an organisation to account? I guess you could hold its members to account, and you definitely should do that, but it doesn't really take into consideration all the things that we've previously talked about in the video, like groupthink and everything like that, and how the group, despite not being alive, does in a weird way hold a certain amount of responsibility over the individual's actions. So yeah, tiny little tangent there, but just so you know where I'm coming from with this. Now, I've made it clear that getting rid of attachments is abhorrent to me, and the best argument I've heard in favour of it is that it works. And you know how I feel about that argument. And I've tried my best to avoid using anecdotal evidence in this video because it's unreliable, unprovable, and one person's individual circumstance does not a valid argument make. But forcing a man whose father hated him, whose mother didn't know him, whose family abandoned him, to just detach himself is cruel. It's cruel and it's wrong. And to argue, well, there's nothing wrong with the detachment thing, it's Dooku's fault for not detaching himself, is also cruel and wrong. And all the, well, it works arguments in the galaxy isn't going to make the blindest bit of difference to that. I did say I didn't agree with the fact that it works, didn't I? I should probably explain that. When looking for arguments in favour of the detachment rule, the evidence that I could find was anecdotal at best. Sorry, just another quick clarification. I didn't mean to suggest that anecdotal evidence is always bad. It can be very useful. The only thing is, it's important not to rely on it too much and make sure it's backed up by more than just itself, basically, or another version of the same anecdote. And I also recognise that as a YouTuber, it can be very hard to stay away from anecdotal evidence, not when constructing your argument, but just when using visual and audio to make your video more interesting, it is pretty much inescapable. So yeah, anecdotal evidence is by no means always bad, but it cannot be your whole argument. And in the case of the attachment argument, all we have is anecdotal. For example, there's the Old Republic trailer that came out recently which showcases a Padawan who was separated from her brother because he wasn't Force sensitive enough to be taken by the Jedi, so his name ended up on a holocron that the Sith were after. And despite the trailer being rightly critical of the Jedi's cruel recruitment practices, I've heard a lot of people say, no, this actually proves the Jedi right, because she had an attachment to her brother and it was that attachment that caused her to hesitate in that crucial moment. As I said, that is totally unreliable because there are so many reasons and so many factors within those reasons as to why a person might make the wrong decision at any given time. That incident is not an argument to get rid of attachments altogether. And I could just so easily flip that argument on its head and say, no, the Jedi are actually wrong because if they had taken the boy, low Force sensitivity or no, because it's a fucking child, then he wouldn't have been on that holocron and she wouldn't have hesitated. But that is an equally unreliable assertion, because it doesn't take into consideration God knows how many variables. You can also make the 1,000 years of peace argument, between the last time the Sith were defeated and the Clone Wars, a time where all was well. It wasn't, it just looked that way from on high, and hardly anybody fell to the dark side during this period. Correlation does not equal causation, but if we are thinking along those lines, I think it can be just as easily, if not more effectively, argued that the reason this is so is because the Sith implemented the rule of two and went into hiding. And especially if you're raised in a group mindset, but even if you're raised in an individualistic one, it becomes so much easier to leave the group if you know there is another group out there who wants you and is willing to take you in. Of course, there are more individualistic people who are brave enough to leave on their own, but it becomes far more likely that people will jump if they know there is a net to catch them. And of course, this was a time when the Sith weren't actively recruiting in the numbers they were before, so there was less Darksiders in general. So for thinking along these lines, you ironically have the Sith to thank for there being less Darksiders during this period. And people like to point to individual examples of someone's attachment getting in the way of their duty, but people fall to the dark side with attachments, people fall to the dark side without them. People's individual feelings and choices can lead to bad consequences.
I didn't know freedom meant people doing stuff that sucks.
Especially since, attachment or no, the Jedi still make a shit ton of bad decisions. Just different ones. And I would argue, just on a personal end by the way, because of the less humane approach, they are worse decisions. I disagree with the fact that it works because individual examples of someone's love for another making them hesitate is one instance of many that can cause people to make the wrong decision. And many things that have the potential to drive people towards the wrong decision also have the potential to drive them towards the right one. This is something that is unquantifiable. So you do this monumental thing of removing a vital part of the human existence, forbidding marriage, splitting up families, and your only argument is that it's necessary. And my response to that argument is...
You don't know that! I'm the only one who knows that.
My theory is that the reason so many people are so willing to jump on board with the supposed effectiveness of this terrible rule is because people like to believe that there is one easily implementable snap-fingers solution to these kind of problems. There isn't. There never is. This originally had its own section in the video, but I found that I was repeating a lot of points I'd previously made. But I did want to say something about it here because I have seen some real mental gymnastics from people just trying their best to say that the Jedi aren't a cult. And the format I've seen when it comes to rebuttals for this is to present the point, say, I know this sounds cultish out of context, but let me give you context. And the context is just another reworked and revised version of the it works or it's necessary argument. They take kids away from their families.
This is not what it looks like.
They raise them isolated from any other potential worldviews or influences.
This is not what it looks like.
They have leaders with unquestionable authority within the group.
This is not what it looks like.
They restrict relationships with people outside the group.
This is not what it looks like.
Any dissenting voices or alternate points of view are pushed out.
This is not what it looks like.
They restrict their members' knowledge of certain things because the knowledge is considered too dangerous.
This is not what it looks like.
Anyone who leaves the group is automatically wrong for doing so.
Oh, come on, wait! This is not what it looks like!
There are only so many times you can defend a cult before I have to start asking if you're in a cult. And besides the it's necessary and it's effective arguments, there is one more interesting one I want to go over. And that's the argument that, unlike in our world, the Force exists. It's a real thing. So, because of that, they can't be a cult. The validity and reasonability of a group's beliefs is not what qualifies them to be a cult. Its behaviours and practices are the things that do that. If the Scientologist Space Emperor suddenly came down and declared himself to be real, Scientology would still be a cult. And there's this really interesting paper called When Prophecy Fails, Faith Persists, and it details a group called the Seekers in America who thought that the end times were going to come in December 1954. It obviously didn't, but even if it did, they would still have been a cult, just a cult that happened to be right about when the world would end. So yeah, once again, watch out for people knocking on your door asking if you've heard the good news. And carrying on from the cult point, is it really that simple? This is going to be a short one because I see this point of view as so short-sighted it ends up lacking empathy as a result. Not that the people who make it lack empathy, mind you, just that the point of view is an unempathetic one. These people have been raised this way their entire lives, no meaningful relationships in the outside world, the Jedi are the only thing resembling a family and support structure they have nothing. And you say, if they don't like being a Jedi, they can just leave. And this is one of those situations where, yeah, the door is open, but is leaving really so simple?
The Jedi Order is your life. You can't just throw it away like this.
This weapon is your life.
You ever wonder why people in very insular and restrictive communities don't just get out even if they want to? Because doing so often means severing yourself from any family support or community you have, not to mention being villainized by those very people. And just because there are people who are strong enough to leave, doesn't mean that the existence of these kind of practices is A-okay. And I've heard a lot of people emphatically argue that the Jedi are not taught to stifle their emotions, they're instead taught to accept and control them. Again, this whole argument is one that's good in theory, but in reality...
Bury your feelings deep down.
And when Anakin goes to Yoda for advice, he gets this bullshit.
Rejoice for those around you who transform into the Force. Mourn them do not. Attachment leads to jealousy. The shadow of greed, that is.
Don't be sad. They're going to be one with the Force. Your emotions, they're born out of jealousy and possessiveness. Don't mourn your loved ones. Instead of validating how he feels and helping him through it, as I've heard people argue the Jedi supposedly do, he is basically told to get over himself, as Dooku was before him. As if meditation and quiet acceptance of the inevitable is good enough. It's not good enough. This is not as bad as the compassion clip from Attack of the Clones, but this is another one of those things where I can't believe people actually see it as helping their case. It's like one person says, the Jedi don't give appropriate emotional support. And another person says, yeah they do, look at this Yoda scene. And they cut to Yoda giving Anakin philosophical advice. Which, and I can't believe I have to say this, is not emotional help. Nor is it an appropriate substitute for it. Yeah, again, I've heard this argument that they are taught to control and accept their emotions. Yeah, taught to control and accept your emotions in ways we thought were appropriate decades ago. Taught to control their emotions in the way an overworked Japanese salaryman would. And we all know how that can sometimes turn out. But it's not the majority. So, I guess the group's practices are all okay. It's the individual's emotional problems that's messing it up for everyone else. There is nothing wrong here! Now, I know people adore Yoda, and even for me, he has his moments. Like, I particularly like him in that first ever Clone Wars episode where he tells the clones how unique they feel in the Force, and how much of a calm, collected little badass he is, just doing all of it with a cheeky smile on his face. And there is, of course, this. So awesome and yet so funny at the same time. But for me, Yoda embodies all the problems with the Jedi. And I really have to stop quoting Darksiders here, but I agree with Count Dooku. The Jedi Order's problem is Yoda. No one can wield that kind of power for centuries without becoming complacent at best or corrupt at worst. He has no idea it's overtaken him. He no longer sees all the little cumulative evils the Republic tolerates and fosters, from slavery to endless wars, and he never asks, why are we not acting to stop this? Live alongside corruption for too long, and you no longer notice the stench. The Jedi cannot help the slaves of Tatooine, but they can help the slave masters. And yes, I am well aware that Dooku is a massive hypocrite, but it wouldn't be Star Wars without most of the characters being massive ideological and moral hypocrites. The Jedi detaching themselves didn't work. It just blinded them to the people they're supposedly trying to help.
I recommend spending more time on the streets instead of flying over them.
And I know I've made jokes about being on the dark side due to just how many times I've agreed with those guys, but the best villains have a point. And the reason great villains have a point is so that the heroes can evolve and become better. And if the villains have this many good points, surely the heroes should change. And while I do believe The Last Jedi was a poor film, I at least sympathise a little bit with what it was trying to do. I'm looking at the path Luke is taking now, and all I want is for him to have a T'Challa moment where he stands in front of a bunch of Force ghosts and says, "All of you are wrong!" And I feel like before we move on, we should get into bias time, because I think I should probably tell you why this seems to bother me more than it does other people, even those who, on a theoretical level, agree with me. The whole "you're too emotional" bullshit. That is something people in the real world genuinely believe, that if you're emotional, you're irrational, which I don't believe is true. Emotions are sometimes right. There is a reason we have them. And not listening to something simply because someone is being emotional or passionate when they say it is stupid. I, clearly, speak about things in a very passionate manner, but always strive to have something to back it up with. Not that that means I'm always right, my information is never complete. So I am biased in this direction because I am naturally a very emotional person. But I always, like I'm doing with this deep disgust I have for the Jedi, examine my emotions and see if it's actually reasonable to feel this way. And I hate this outdated idea of emotional equaling irrational. It doesn't. Yet let's listen to the person who's spouting utter bullshit because they're saying it in a calm voice, rather than listening to the emotional person who's actually making sense. And I've heard the emotional thing before, and when I hear that, all I want to do is pull a reverse Hulk and say, "You want to see me when I'm calm? You won't like me when I'm calm." So yeah, I've heard loads of arguments that the Jedi are not taught that emotions are bad, they're taught to accept and control them, yada yada. And I touched upon that Old Republic trailer, and I just can't believe that people are trying to find ways to make that okay. And again, total opinion time. I feel like that master would have had to have rationalized his actions all the time he was raising that child, because any emotion he might have felt for that poor boy is irrational. So best to just get rid of it. In my opinion, whether you were just born that way or you deliberately dehumanized yourself for the greater good,
Shut it!
You have to be lacking at least a certain amount of humanity to be able to stomach doing something like that. And those who defend the Jedi's actions and say this proves attachments are bad are kind of accidentally saying that the ideal thing to do would have been to not just leave one, but leave both those children in that situation. And say what you want about the Mandalorians and all the terrible things they do, because God, do they do some terrible things, but in this particular instance, oh boy, did they get it right.
It is a foundling by creed. It is in your care. Until it is of age or reunited with its own kind, you are as its father. This is the way.
You're goddamn right, this is the way. And it is weird how the Mandalorians seem to have more open and emotionally healthy relationships with the children they take under their care, and they are basically the kings of tough love. This being more on the ideological end of the spectrum is more opinion-based than the other things I've said, and most of this video has been opinion-based. Except for the children thing, I will not budge on that. It's disgusting and wrong and nobody should be defending it. But back to this point. I can see my point of view illustrated within the character of Anakin, because he is often angry, but it seems like from the Jedi's point of view, the only reason he shouldn't be angry is because he should be in control. Instead of actually addressing why he's angry, they address the anger itself. And if we imagine the application of this way of looking at emotions, it becomes very clear how backwards, unfair, and arguably even sinister it is. Something bad happens to you, or a wrong is committed against you. It's your anger that's the problem. Not the wrong that created the anger. It's the anger itself. So the Jedi say, yeah, it's natural for you to feel this way, but best for everyone involved if you just let it go. Yeah, that's very convenient for you, isn't it, Jedi? You know those internet posts you see from people who are in toxic families and they've been wronged by a family member, but they are the one who becomes the problem because they are the one who is upset and disturbing the peace. So they're the problem, not the one who actually committed the wrong. So this is what leads me to believe that the Jedi don't deal with their emotions. They deal with the symptoms. They don't deal with the cause. And I am sorry for this emotion section running for so long, but I did have a lot I wanted to cover because I wanted to be as clear as possible as to why I feel this way. And I wanted to say that I'm sorry, and I don't mean that as a cop-out, by the way. I know that people tearing into franchises and characters and ideologies and life lessons that you love can be upsetting sometimes. But remember, anger leads to hate. Hate leads to... No, that's a bad joke. But in all seriousness, I am genuinely sorry. And if you've made it this far and this is not vibing with you, first of all, thank you. And second, you should probably turn it off because it's about to get worse. And I know you're probably thinking, how could it possibly get any worse? Oh, it's going to.
You couldn't be a greater disappointment.
Not just another number. None of us are.
Master Jedi, we must terminate this trooper immediately.
I'm a living being.
Technically, he is property of the Republic.
The planet calls us men, not clones. Men.
The canon laws have suggested that we terminate the Republic.
That someday this war is going to end. What happens to us then?
Well, I was going to have to talk about this one eventually. And I do plan to do a video essay at some point examining the slavery of the clones and how modern portrayals of slavery have left us unable to identify it, both in fiction and real life. But that is something that both requires and deserves a cooler head. So I'm just going to be focusing on the Jedi and their culpability in relation to the clones' state of enslavement. There are arguments that the clones aren't slaves, most of which are compiled in this quite frankly psychotic Quora post. They can't be slaves because they were never free to begin with?
What the fuck?
But to start off, I would like to direct your attention to an episode of the Clone Wars TV show when I first saw what the clones actually were and what potentially irreversibly cemented my poor opinion of the Jedi. This episode is Season 1, Episode 16, The Hidden Enemy. It starts off pretty straightforward. Obi-Wan and Anakin are discussing with their top-ranking clones the next best move, and when they leave on a mission, it becomes clear to the clones, Commander Cody and Captain Rex, that someone has been listening in and passing on information to the enemy, and they investigate. They uncover the traitor, send him off to whatever punishment is waiting for him, and all is well. Except it's not. And it's not for one very big reason.
She offered me something more important. Something you wouldn't understand. Freedom!
The traitor Slick explains that he did this because the Jedi are keeping him and his brothers enslaved and he wanted his freedom. From the very first episode, I had been really interested in the clones, as the show does a great job of making them all feel like individual and often likeable characters. But this was the moment when I first started to get really interested in the clones as a concept, and started searching for information on what they were and where they came from, because to that point in the series, nothing had really been said about it. I know it was explained in the prequel films, but yeah, those films, absent external media, can be hard to follow at the best of times. And when I did, I was shook to my very core. I felt genuinely sick. A Jedi, due to a Force vision he had about a war with the Sith, commissioned a clone army from a race of geneticists. And this is a big argument for the clones not being slaves, because they were specifically created for that purpose. And let me say this, loud and clear. When you bring sentient life into this world, you do not get to choose what its purpose is. Yeah, I had this baby because I need domestic help and I'll raise it accordingly. I don't give a shit why the clones were made. They're here now, they're sentient life, and they deserve all the rights and freedoms that come with that. In the interest of fairness though, I don't actually blame the creation of the clones on the Jedi, as it was a rogue Jedi manipulated by a Sith who commissioned them without the Order's consent. And that does again open a really interesting argument about how much culpability a group has in an individual's decision making, but this is one of those instances where I'm actually inclined not to blame the group. They are culpable for going along with it though, fighters for freedom and democracy that they are.
Suddenly it reeks of hypocrisy in here.
The clones are born, artificially aged, brutally trained, brainwashed, decommissioned if they show signs of individuality or rebelliousness. They would also have been sterilized if it wasn't for that lowering their effectiveness as soldiers. And that does bring up the interesting idea that our species need to fight and need to mate are intrinsically linked, which is both disturbing and not at all surprising. And if you, for some reason, still believe this is okay, it's probably due to some very comfortable euphemisms employed. So let me put it in very clear terms here. They are farming humans. That's literally what they're doing. They are farming humans. And I'm laying this all out not because this is something the Jedi themselves did, but something they made use of. And if the word slave still doesn't sit well with you, then I'll paraphrase Thor Ragnarok and say they are people who were bought and then employed. And who also can't leave.
Yes word, yes word.
Sorry, the prisoners with jobs have armed themselves.
Okay, that's better, that's better.
So, back to the episode, and this is why this is simultaneously my favourite and least favourite episode. Because while the mystery is great, the characters are fun, and the moral question is interesting, it makes me concerned about the writer's priorities, because even though they lay out Slick's point of view very well, they still frame Slick as being the villain here. When he tells the Jedi that he and his brothers are slaves, there isn't even a lifting of the eyebrows, a moment of hesitation, realization, or sympathy on their faces. They just keep looking down their noses at this slave soldier who tried to escape. Seriously, the clones. Rex and Cody have an excuse here. They were born, bred, brainwashed their entire lives to believe that this was their lot in life, and not only did they not deserve any more, but what they had was actually a very honourable and great good position to be in.
We're just clones, sir. We're meant to be expendable.
But Anakin and Obi-Wan don't see it. Obi-Wan, you're a smart cookie. Why hasn't this clicked in that big old brain of yours? Anakin, you are a fucking slave! It's so obvious what the clones are. It is said to the Jedi's faces, and they don't even Do you have slaves you don't want escaping? Of course you don't, because you're a decent person who believes in freedom and democracy.
Zygerian scum. I'll handle that slaver.
My allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy!
Oh well, this is embarrassing. Do you have slaves you don't want escaping? Well, you can solve that problem by using this simple method. First, be nice to your slaves. Second, tell them that their state of being is in service to a higher cause. Tell them that they are heroes of this cause, and they will be rewarded non-monetarily for their service and sacrifice. That way, if there are ones who still want to escape, your other slaves will do the job for you, leaving you free to glower in righteous anger at those disloyal bastards. Warning, use of this method may result in loss of the moral high ground, loss of most of your morality, and a decent bit of your soul. Terms and conditions apply. The episode's director was clearly going for villain with sympathetic motivations rather than someone who was just simply right, as he described Slick's logic as understandable. I'll say, and what cements that the writers weren't really taking the slavery thing seriously was this.
It's the Jedi who keep my brothers enslaved. We do your bidding. We serve at your whim.
Wow, they have actually come out and said that the soldiers fighting under the command of our heroes are slaves. Are they going to expand on this? Nope, we never see this character again. And that disappoints me, not only because they made light of a very tragic and uncomfortable truth before dismissing it, but this is a very unique clone who was so individualistic that brainwashing from birth didn't work on him. Think of the dramatic potential if you'd actually leaned into that, as I believe you probably should have done. The amount of times this show has talked about freedom and democracy, especially in that Zygerian slaves arc, the characters and writers have failed to address the fact that they are fighting for freedom with an army of slaves. Seriously, that Zygerian slave arc had me laughing, literally laughing, at the point of how nonsensical it was for the Jedi to not have some kind of light bulb moment. But no, they just go on making sad faces at the institution of slavery while they've got an entire army of slaves backing them up.
Suddenly it reeks of hypocrisy in here.
And this is all done, again, so as not to draw attention to the fact that our heroes are participating in one of the worst crimes against humanity possible.
Thought we wouldn't notice, but we did.
I am not hating on this show. I genuinely love it. The plight of the clones is otherwise laid out very well, even beautifully at some points, but it's more compared to the plights of soldiers and veterans than slaves. So if the clones are slave soldiers, they got the soldier part down to perfection. They just, at best, sidestepped and at worst, ignored the slave part. This is the one thing that just really baffles and confounds me. People can argue Slick's villainy all day long to me, but he targeted the armory rather than the mess hall where the clones were gathered, and clones are much more expensive and time-consuming to make than weapons. And as far as we know, there were no casualties, as Cody said.
If you loved your brothers, you wouldn't have put them at risk.
Rather than killed them. And even though he didn't try to take any of his brothers with him, they would have turned him in a heartbeat if he tried. But let's say that Slick was lying when he said this was for all clones. Let's say that this was a absolute 100% selfish decision on his part. So, he is trapped in a place he doesn't want to be, forced to fight and die for people who own his life. Doesn't he, as a sentient being, have the right to escape this situation? Even if it hurts his brothers, and I'm sorry. If I am a slave, my brothers are slaves, and they would turn me in for trying to escape because they are so beholden to their masters, I'm sorry, that's where my loyalty to you ends. Hashtag Slick did nothing wrong. Okay, he did do one thing wrong. When everyone started turning on Chopper, he should have confessed immediately. Hashtag Slick did one thing wrong. And it really disturbs me as to who the writers are framing as being in the right here. And before we get back to the Jedi, I just want to say that this is not where my dislike of the Jedi themselves, but rather how the writers and audiences seem to view and excuse their abominable behaviour began. This whole crazy thing you're watching right now, it all began here. And back to the Jedi, I've heard the defence, not only for this point, but for many other things they've done, that they were under orders from the Republic. Yeah, Nuremberg is that way.
I recognize the council has made a decision, but given that it's a stupid-ass decision, I've elected to ignore it.
A lot of wrongs against the clones committed by the Jedi come down to, again, negligence. There are many examples pertaining to the Jedi's negligence, but I think it can all be summed up with a look at Shaak Ti. What can I say about Master Shaak Ti?
About as much use as a nun's tits.
While most of the Jedi's negligence towards the clones can be ascribed to out of sight, out of mind, the baffling stupidity of Shaak Ti during the uncovering of the inhibitor chips was just infuriating to watch. Because unlike a lot of Jedi who had direct dealings with clones, Shaak Ti saw them through their creation, training, and sickening mistreatment by the Kaminoans, which she had a hand in, I wouldn't go so far as to say stopping, but at least easing. For example, the euthanization of imperfect product. So, what happens when she is given proof that the men she has under her care and authority have chips inside their heads inserted without their knowledge or consent? Does she listen to one of the victims? The ARC Trooper, a kind of clone known for their impressive thinking and reasoning abilities, and being a clone knows his brothers better than anyone else? No, she decides to put her trust in the people who actively euthanize the men she purports to be under her care.
Do not be afraid. Your friend is in quite capable hands. Dr. Nala Say is the chief medical scientist on Kamino. She was one of the primary engineers of all the clones.
People who see them not as
living beings,
as you apparently do, but as property to be used and discarded, so much so that even in death they are used. I don't care if she was convinced that Fives was struck with grief. She was so negligent that she failed to properly listen to him, and the times where she did give him the smallest benefit of the doubt were woefully inadequate. I've heard again defense of this, saying she was doing what she thought was a reasonable course of action, and Fives's emotional state kind of put her off. And one, harkening back to what I said in the political section, you know what, Billy, you say it so much better than I do.
Don't give me that shite.
And two, Jesus Christ, he just lost someone he loved. Maybe what she saw as a reasonable course of action was lacking a crucial amount of humanity, and maybe a little bit of attachment might have helped in this situation. She has seen firsthand how these men are treated, and I am infinitely disturbed that the involuntary insertion of a chip alone does not cause concern for people who claim to be in service of freedom and democracy.
Suddenly it reeks of hypocrisy in here.
While Anakin's dismissal of Fives can be ascribed to blind trust in the system and the Chancellor and an inability to think critically combined with how Palpatine managed to make the situation look, Shaak Ti's actions here are just... I don't even know what to say to them. This is not ignoring potential wrongdoing because it contradicts your worldview. This is blatant disregard for basic humanity.
A Jedi does not feel concern, Lamasu.
You can say that again. And I don't want to hear all that wishy-washy stuff about, oh no, you're misinterpreting her words. She didn't mean it that way. She doesn't feel the bad concern. She still feels like the good concern. No. She said in her own words that she doesn't feel concern, and her actions damn well back that up. Not to mention that she, and by extension the Jedi as a whole, are totally blasé about the potential murder of one of the men under them, who the audience say they treat so well. Honestly, just the way she says this here gives me chills.
The Kaminoans have suggested that we terminate the clone. I believe this solution is ill-advised.
Imagine if it were anyone other than a clone and she's talking this way. Imagine the Kaminoans were arguing for the termination of a Jedi after a breakdown in the field. Just insert anyone other than a clone in this situation and tell me it would elicit the same reaction. And just mini bias here, maybe I'm taking this to heart because the clones are all my babies. I've adopted every single one of them. I know she's not arguing for the termination. Cold-blooded murder. I'm not trying to say that she is, but this is a situation that should elicit more than an I disagree. And the fact that none of the other Jedi are reacting to the potential cold-blooded murder of one of their men, oh god, they treat them so well! The Kaminoans are arguing for the termination of an either physically or mentally ill man who can't advocate for himself. Let's call that Plan B. And the ease with which they let this go is astounding. A soldier under the Jedi's command killed a Jedi and they just accept the Chancellor's flimsy half-assed excuse that is backed up by a race of eugenicist sociopaths who, until they arrived, were euthanizing and experimenting on said men. Really? That's good enough for you? Yet when you put euthanization next to following orders, doesn't sound so good, does it? But even besides this, they show later on that they are very happy to go behind the Chancellor's back. Yet the death of a human being wasn't enough, but someone starts trying to muscle in on your special club. That's when you get your arses in gear. And you think there is nothing more you need to investigate. Yes, of course, it was a parasite, totally isolated incident. Just listen to the eugenicists who are telling you the same thing. There is nothing more to see here. And I forgot about this scene. This makes it even worse. They uncover a plot to destroy the Jedi using the clones, and this doesn't come to mind for any of you. Shakti doesn't feel the need to stand up and say, hey, remember that clone malfunction we pretty much ignored where a clone shot a Jedi unprovoked and another clone was convinced there was something sinister going on? And then Anakin says, yeah, I remember. Before Fives died, he said there was a plot against the Jedi and that there were chips inside their heads that could make them kill us. You don't think that has anything to do with this plot to destroy the Jedi using the clones, right? Absolutely not. Chips that the Kaminoans admit alter behavior, making soldiers bred for obedience do something against the Jedi? Absurd, that is. This is not my perfect hindsight 2020 vision at work. This is the Jedi being arrogant, emotionally disabled marionettes who can't read a situation for shit. And I don't know if you've seen this British sitcom, The Thick of It.
What's that film that you love? What film? The guy's got a tinfoil pal and a pedal bin. His father's a robot and he's fucking fucked his sister. Star Wars. That's the one, right? Kill all the bad guys. And you'll be able to blow up the big... The Death Star thing. Yeah. Live happily ever after on the planet of the teddy bears.
Very works.
Which details the ins and outs of the political system and just how little margin for error there is and should be. There is a reason we expect a lot of people in power, because their mistakes are not just oopsies. And while this can certainly be applied to many members of the Order, and the people who sit on the council in particular, there are times when I've wanted to go full Malcolm Tucker on this woman.
Allow me to pop a jaunty little bonnet on your purview and ram it up the shitter with a lubricated horse cock.
But I'm gonna tone it down and bring up two more issues that made me lose all respect for her. If I ever had any to begin with. One is this instance.
You were created in our laboratories. You are Kaminoan property.
Correction. Technically, he is property of the Republic.
And I know that she is doing the best thing here by getting Fives out from under the control of the Kaminoans and under her control. But if you get yourself into a situation where the objectively best thing to do is to lord your ownership over a living being over another person, then you should probably take yourself away, go sit in a corner and ask yourself, how the fuck did I get here? And 2, there's this scene where Fives' little med droid friend says he's going away to have his mind wiped and put on sanitation duty, and it just shows what the Kaminoans think of Shakti, that she is supposed to be in charge of this facility, or at the very least in charge of the clone's well-being on this facility, and they think that they can take a clone who she has had recent interactions with, mind wipe him, put him on sanitation duty at the very base that she lives on, and they can do that right under her nose without her noticing. And taking everything into consideration, I think they're probably right to think that. And one more thing, just to harken back to the downfall section, there are no excuses for Shakti here. Even if this wasn't negligence by normal standards, which it definitely was, the Jedi have put themselves in a position of being a powerful religious organization who are running a military and have very strong ties to the reigning political power. And 2 men under their care who cannot advocate for themselves died needlessly under their watch. She was in a position where better should have been expected. Yeah, the Jedi just treat the clones so fucking well!
A Jedi does not feel concern, Lamasu.
She said it. Not me. And that brings us to the ever-famous "the Jedi were good to the clones" argument. A position so infantile when looking at the institution of slavery that I feel like the wrongness of it should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. This kind of attitude seems to boil down to they made the clones' lives more tolerable, so that makes them good. Let's discount the fact that they continue to use them in their war without stopping the brainwashing that makes them perfectly compliant to their cause, and even more disturbingly, not giving them the freedom to opt out even if they do show a desire to. Why does this make the Jedi good? They stop the wholesale slaughter of hundreds of imperfect clones. They talk to them like they're actual human beings with feelings. The Jedi are not being good to the clones, they're just showing them basic human freaking decency. Why are you patting them on the back for this? They're just treating them the way any living, thinking, feeling person deserves to be treated by right. They're not being good, they're just being not shit. They do not deserve admiration or applause for being not shit. Just like you and me don't deserve applause for being not shit to the less fortunate in our daily lives. Really, I am just baffled by this point of view. Look how well they treated the clones. They didn't. I mean, on a personal level, yes, because duh, be nice to people. But they still participated in the enslavement of these people. If I buy a plantation where the conditions of the slaves are awful, and because I'm not heartless, I walk in and I say, this place is a disgrace, and I create better working conditions for my slaves, I am no less a slave owner. I mean, yes, I'm sure the slaves would much rather work for me than the previous master, but I am still an absolute parasite of a human being for making use of people's lives this way. I am especially less inclined to give them any moral credit because they said, let's get rid of the wholesale slaughter, but let's keep the brainwashing and indentured service. We'll probably be needing that. And the final justification I'm going to go over is the argument that the Republic needed the clone army. So, slavery is older than civilization itself. Out of the thousands of years of civilization, there have been businesses, livelihoods, wars, even societies that have relied on the labor of slaves. They needed a slave army? So fucking what? So to close this point, the Jedi are morally reprehensible for their very sizable part in this. And I've heard the fans who are at least willing to acknowledge it lay out the plight of the clones and say, yeah, what the Jedi did wasn't great, but they had to. No, they didn't. Anything anyone, any society, order, or person who would do this to survive doesn't deserve to survive. Better they die out having never done this than live with an atrocity as great as this having been committed. And alluding back to some things I said in the emotions section, this is where die-hard utilitarianism gets you. And it disturbs me so much that so many people who love the Jedi and have grown up with the idea of them being the good guys are so willing to either ignore this or leave it as a footnote in the analysis of the Order. So that's it. That is my first impression, not a re-examining, my first honest-to-God impression of the Jedi. What they stand for and what they've done. They are so many things I despise in the world. And I would be really interested to see if someone's able to change my mind on that. I doubt it though. Maybe I should have had something stronger. I originally intended for this just to be a silly why I hate the Space Wizards video, but my first impression of the Jedi, a group that so many people love and admire, was disgust. So I did as I usually do, I started reading and researching and examining myself and my own biases to see if it was actually reasonable to feel this way. And the conclusion I've come to is that, yes, I do believe it's reasonable for me to feel this way, but at the same time, who I am as a person, the cocktail of everything that I am, is primed to hate the Jedi. I am a highly emotional, extremely attached, fairly anti-organized religion type of person who hates moral absolutism and hypocrisy. So I'm still not budging on the slavery and the kids, but everything else the Jedi are is just primed to get on my tits. It's like someone took every food I dislike and made a soup out of it. And I think what's really bothering me is that whenever you so much as question the Jedi's ideology and philosophy, you're told that you're wrong because Lucas said so. Yet Legends have misinterpreted the attachment rule as Lucas explains. Once again. So, George Lucas is a man with his own philosophies and beliefs that, like everyone else on this planet, he is more than entitled to. I'm not saying that my philosophy and way of looking at the world is bulletproof, it most certainly is not. And ironically, that is actually a part of my personal philosophy. There is no one right way. But I did not write a book or a movie, put my own personal philosophy onto it and say, this is the unquestionable moral good that cannot be questioned, because to question it is to question canon, leaving no room for effective ideological criticism. No, the Jedi are just right because their creator said so. That is the most all-encompassing justification I've heard, and I think it's rubbish. And I do not believe that any creator gets to tell their audience what is morally right and wrong in fiction. I am not misinterpreting the Jedi's moral philosophy. I'm just interpreting it in a way Lucas didn't intend. I think you have to let go of this deification of the creator in order to have important discussions surrounding these limitless topics, so we can grow as people both artistically and intellectually. No one, not even the creator, gets to tell me what's right and wrong when I read and watch something. No one. And I want to pose something just at the end of this video because, again, when writing this, I was reminded of our Rick and Morty episode. Not a particularly good one, but one that contained a line that has stuck with me.
Everyone wants people they like to be right.
Yeah, that is true. So from that point on, I started thinking, do I actually agree with what this person thinks, or do I just like them? And on a similar vein, to the many people I've come across on this journey that have repeatedly said that all these criticisms that not just me, but other Jedi detractors bring up so many times and are delivered a response of, this is all down to just a misinterpretation and misunderstanding of the Jedi. I ask, in good faith, isn't it possible that I do understand the Jedi and their ideology and find them repulsive anyway?
Was there ever a moment that any of you said, hey, you know, this plan might backfire? No, that never occurs to you, because you guys are jerks, and you never learn from your mistakes. And that's why everyone at school thinks you guys are assholes.